All right, we're in Midrash Tanchuma, so everybody open your Midrash Tanchuma. Should have got one of these. No, just kidding. We're in Genesis, and we're talking about that time Abraham got circumcised. So he gets circumcised, and then the next day, this is in Genesis 18, he's sitting in the door of his tent. And again, because in the previous chapter he got circumcised, the Torah itself doesn't indicate, right, that what's happening right now in Genesis 18:1 is that Abraham is recovering from circumcision. This is something that the sages derived because it happened in the previous chapter. If you're just reading this and you're trying to parse it like a novel or whatever, you might think a lot of time has passed, and that the circumcision wound is not relevant to the story anymore. But of course, it's not how the sages read it. The sages read it as this: Abraham is there in the door of his tent in the heat of the day with a fresh circumcision wound, which is somewhat debilitating, waiting for people to come by so he can show hospitality to them. And God shows up, like we talked about last week. God shows up because God visits the sick. God practices the mitzvah of visiting the sick. God practices all the mitzvot. He does all, it's not just a theoretical idea that everything good comes from Hashem. He actually personally fulfills the mitzvot. And this, Judaism enjoins a Jewish person to visit someone who is sick or recovering from a surgery in this case. And so Hashem comes to visit Abraham. And last week we ended with this long sort of digression where the sages stated 7 verses in which God indicates his humility. And we talked about humility for God, or sometimes translated condescension, as this idea that God, despite being a king, not just a king, but the King of Kings, will personally visit people who are in distress, the widow, the orphan, and the sick person, etc. And that's where we stopped last week. The next section is a sort of capstone on that discussion, which we probably should have just read last week. It says, after Abraham was circumcised, the Holy One, blessed be he, appeared before him in all his glory to inquire after his health, as it is said, and the Lord appeared to him. Hello, Terry, Penny. We are in Genesis 18, if you can hear me there. So now we have another, it's not a new section in the Midrash, but the discussion seems to a little dog leg in it here. Rabbi Yitzhak Nafcha, looks about right, began the discussion with the verse in Exodus 20, beginning in verse 21. It's very common in the Midrash to start a discussion with a different verse and work your way back to the verse that's that is sort of on board here, on deck for the Midrash. A lot of this is a collection of ideas. So someone a long time ago had a lesson that sort of ended on this verse that we're on. They'll throw it in here. So Rabbi Yitzhak here says from Exodus 20, starting in verse 21, an altar of earth shalt thou make me. And I think over in verse 24 it must say, in every place I cause my name to be mentioned, I will come unto thee and bless thee. If you recall the timeline we learned when we were going through Ramban a few years ago, you used to be able to do this. There used to be a rule that wherever you were, you could build your own altar and you could sacrifice animals on it. A private altar is usually how it's translated in the Art Scroll Ramban that we went through for about 3 years. This became deprecated, it became illegal after the tabernacle was erected because of different problems they were having with people building private altars with sacrificing to the wrong gods. So now you have to bring it to the temple. And then it flips back and forth just slightly over the next couple of decades. But currently it's not allowed. You're not allowed to build an altar of earth. God won't come visit you at that altar. The halacha says the only place now that you can bring a sacrifice is a properly built temple in Jerusalem. Just so you know. But this is a window into an earlier practice. What did they do before the tabernacle? Well, you could build your own private altar of earth and you could sacrifice animals to Hashem. Now the Midrash will go on to explain this. It says, the Holy One, blessed be He, declared, since I reveal myself to anyone who brings a burnt offering or a peace offering in order to bless him. Right, so that's what the Midrash wants us to get from this Exodus passage. Right, in Exodus 20:24, God says, if you do this, I'll come to you and I'll bless you. He's going to show up somehow. How this looked, how this actually happened, what kind of phenomena someone would witness is not clear. We have a few instances in the Old Testament where someone makes a sacrifice and some amazing phenomenon happens, like Elijah calls down fire from heaven, but that may not be the norm. What this revelation of God looks like or what happens isn't clear from the text. Rabbi Yitzhak, it says, what we should learn from this is that God would reveal himself. He would reveal himself in that time to the people who brought burnt offerings and peace offerings in order to bless them, but not just a blessing, but he shows up. He says, I'll come unto thee and bless thee. So Rabbi Yitzhak says, God reveals himself. He reveals himself to people who bring physical offerings of animals. And so Rabbi Yitzhak's reasoning is, if God does this for any jerk who knows how to make a pile of rocks or earth and has an animal, like how much more so, he says, would I reveal myself to Abraham, who sacrificed himself for me? So this says fairly outright, which is something that's only really hinted at up till now in the Midrash. And it's this idea or this analogy will continue through this section. The analogy between circumcision and sacrifice. And of course, the common denominator there is the blood. When a person undergoes circumcision, a proper circumcision, there is blood. And they lose something. It's sort of similar to an animal that dies and loses its life. It's not the same thing, but you can see how they're analogous. By the way, that's why you want a mohel. If you're Jewish, you want a mohel to circumcise your children, because the device that many doctors use at the doctor's office does not draw blood. So it's not a halachically valid circumcision without blood. So Abraham circumcising himself is characterized as being a form of self-sacrifice, similar to bringing an offering. In fact, in Abraham's case here, Rabbi Yitzhak, the way he forms the argument, he seems to think that Abraham undergoing circumcision is quite a bit more than just offering an animal. It doesn't, it might hurt your pocketbook to sacrifice one of your animals, but the rabbis say a small hole in the body creates a large hole in the soul. A wound on one's own body is a serious issue. And Abraham has undergone that sacrifice for Hashem's sake. So Rabbi Yitzhak argues, someone who brings an offering, God will appear. How much more will God appear or reveal himself to Abraham? Hence it is said, Rabbi Yitzhak continues, And the Lord appeared unto him. Rabbi Aha said, is that a A or a chat? I don't know, I'm not going to look it up. Rabbi Aha said, I will prove to you that the Holy One, blessed be he, strengthened Abraham. In context, what he means here is normally the wound of circumcision is debilitating. However, Abraham didn't appear to suffer from these effects. Therefore, he must have been supernaturally strengthened by God. So Rabbi Aha argues, on the very day he circumcised himself, while his blood was still flowing, you're probably like a Band-Aid or something. You're saying it hasn't healed yet. It's not just going everywhere. He circumcised Ishmael and all the men of his household. How many men were born in his home? Well, Rabbi Aha says 318, which is interesting. Recall that someone who makes a convert is counted as sort of being that person's father, or like they created their soul. So he may not literally mean that 318 people were born. They're obviously not his descendants. We would know that if Abraham had 318 children. These are, well, how did they end up in his household? How were they born? Who were they born to be born into his home? This may be an allusion to the idea that they're converts. When you make a convert, it's like they're born again. This is why when Jesus talks about being born again, we have some reference material. We know it's not a completely new idea. In the New Testament, there's language like that in Judaism we can hang some of these ideas on. It's talking about, it narrows down what Jesus could be talking about. Which is probably not talking about conversion to Judaism because he's talking to a Jew, but it's a similar idea. It's the general ecosystem of thought. We have to look there for a definition of born again. Anyway, so Abraham has 318 people that Rabbi Aha says were born in his home. And if that many were born, how many others must he have purchased? They're assuming that Abraham's, household of 318 must be much smaller than his retinue of slaves. That's what they're saying. That's what our Rabbi Aha is saying. And Genesis 17:23 indicates that Abraham had bought people. It says Abraham took his son Ishmael and all that were born in his house and all that were bought with money. And then what did he do? He circumcised them a few verses later. And that self-same day was Abraham circumcised, and Ishmael his son, and all the men of his house, born in his house, and bought with money. It continued until Abraham piled up a hill of foreskins, and a river of blood poured forth from his home. Again, evoking the idea of sacrifice. A circumcision might not create that much blood, but hundreds of circumcisions create a lot of blood. It's going to start looking more like you slaughtered a giant cow or something. But of course, Abraham did himself first, and then he went with that circumcision wound still not healed yet and circumcised hundreds of other people. So that's the argument. He must have been supernaturally strengthened to be able to undertake that task. The Midrash continues, thereupon, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to his ministering angels, come, let us visit the sick. They replied, Master of the universe, what is man that thou takest knowledge of him, or the son of man that thou makest account of him? Famous verse from Psalm 144. Why should you go into an unclean place, into an area bathed in blood and defilement with an evil stench? The angels sometimes do this. The angels sometimes provide sort of a heavenly counterpoint. They'll argue with God about what he's decided to do. The Midrash talks about creation the same way. When God decided to create people, the angels are like, what? That's dumb. Don't do that. And he does it anyway. But God always has an answer for the angels that question his choices. He says here, be assured The blood from the circumcision is sweeter to me than myrrh and frankincense. And thus Solomon sang, and this, Hebrew poetry is a little hard to translate. One way to translate it would be, until the day breathes and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. One other translation is, when the day blows gently and the shadows flee, I'll go to the mountain of myrrh to the hill of frankincense. The rabbi here has God saying, this verse alludes to Abraham, who was called myrrh, as it says in Psalm 45:9. Myrrh, aloes, and cassia are all your garments, for all your robes are fragrant with myrrh and aloe and cassia. This is, if Abraham is myrrh, it stands to reason that Isaac must be aloe and Jacob must be cassia. Cassia is what you buy at the supermarket when you buy cinnamon. If you want real cinnamon, you got to go to the Indian grocery. You got to grind it yourself, probably. That scroll-looking thing you buy when you buy a cinnamon stick is cassia. It's not. Cinnamon looks just like tree bark. I've been beating that drum for 10 years. I'm not going to stop. Real cinnamon is better. Go to the Indian grocery or get it on Amazon. Real cinnamon. It's not as strong, but it's better. It's more subtle. It's certainly better in any dessert dish. But anyway, that's what cassia is. It tastes just like cinnamon, but like twice as strong. This Song of Solomon verse was chapter 4, verse 6. It's going to come back here in a second. All right, the next section begins here, and we're still on Genesis 18:1. The Lord appeared unto Abraham, by the terebinths of Mamre. Now, there's a few different people who are not Abraham who show up in the narrative here, but usually only for a little while. But we get the idea that Abraham knew these guys and had some kind of relationship with them, but that relationship's never explored. If someone were novelizing this today, we would have Abraham, talking with these guys, going on some adventures, having conversations. But the Torah is very, careful how many words it uses. And anything that's not absolutely necessary is just not there. But we get the idea, sort of, that Abraham might have had some friends here in the land of Canaan, namely Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. So the Midrash embellishes the narrative as Abraham speaks to his three friends, almost exactly like what we find, for example, in the book of Job. Abraham speaks to his three friends for advice in this section. So the Midrash begins, why did the Holy One, blessed be he, appear by the terebinths of Mamre? Why not the terebinths of Aner or terebinths of Eshcol? What's special about Mamre? Why is he given this distinct honor? Midrash continues, may the name of the Holy One, blessed be he, be blessed, for he does not withhold a reward from any of his creatures. Abraham had three friends, Aner, Eshcol, and Mamre. And when the Holy One commanded Abraham to circumcise himself, he consulted each of them. He first went to Aner and related to him what the Holy One had said. Aner replied, hey, remember that big battle you just had with those 5 kings? What happens when their kids come after you? What happens when their reserves come after you, man? Do you wish to cripple yourself so severely that when the descendants of the kings whom you have slain attack, you will be unable even to flee from them? He left him and went to Eshcol and told him what the Lord had commanded. Eshcol responded, aren't you a little old for this? You're an old man. If you're circumcised, considerable blood will flow from you, and you will not be able to survive the loss and will perish. Whereupon he departed from him and went to Mamre and said, what do you advise? Mamre retorted, are you asking me to tell you whether or not to do what God said? Do you need to seek my advice in this matter? Didn't he release you from the fiery furnace, perform miracles in your behalf, and rescue you from kings? Fact is, you would have been destroyed long ago were it not for his strength and his might. He saved your 248 limbs, and yet you ask advice concerning merely a piece of one of your organs? Do as he has commanded. Thereupon the Holy One, blessed be he, exclaimed, blessed shall you be for having advised him to be circumcised. I shall reveal myself to him only in your territory. Hence, it is written, the Lord appeared to him by the terebinths of Mamre. Genesis 18:1 continues that he sat in the tent door in the heat of the day, or as the day grew hot. Why does the Torah mention that it was hot that day? We know what part of the world it is. We know what the weather's like. What's the significance of the heat? It doesn't seem to have a difference. You ever hear of Chekhov's gun? Chekhov's gun is a literary trope. It means if you're reading a book and it mentions, oh, and there was a gun over the fireplace or something like that, you can assume later on in the book someone's going to use that gun, right? The author's not just mentioning random things to set the stage. Everything's carefully chosen, and these elements are going to come back later in the story if it's a good author. That's sort of how it works. The same in like a movie. They mention something and it doesn't seem to matter. It comes all the way back at the end. You've all seen this happen in different types of literature. Well, the Torah, even though it's nonfiction, still, why you have to ask, why does it mention? It's not just because it was true. There's lots of things that were true at this time that it didn't tell us about. Why did it tell us about the heat of the day here? The Midrash says it indicates that the Holy One, blessed be he, had made the day extremely hot so that no travelers would pass by. If the travelers were passing by, Abraham wouldn't be able to help himself. He'd have to get up and prepare food for them, etc. Of course, he's going to have to do it anyway. We're not there yet. Another explanation is that somehow this is connected to that Song of Solomon, chapter 4, verse 6. When the day blows gently and the shadows flee, I will go to the mountain of myrrh, to the hill of frankincense. I don't know how they make this connection. The day being hot and the day breathing doesn't appear to me to have any terribly similar, words in Hebrew. But however, maybe this idea that is to connect this hot day with this Song of Solomon 4:6 passage by saying that this is a tiny hint about a much hotter day. In other words, the day of judgment. The heat of the day may be a tiny hint toward the day of judgment, where God will judge the earth with fire. And Song of Solomon 4:6 is also a reference to that day. So the Midrash is going to connect these two verses and several others here. And Song of Solomon 4:6, until the day breatheth, this refers to Judgment Day, as it says in Malachi 3:19. Behold, the day comes, it burns as a furnace, right? Heat of the day, heat of the day. You see the connection. And all the proud and all that work wickedness shall be stubble. And the day that comes shall set them ablaze, says the Lord of hosts, that it shall leave them neither root nor branch. And so we have all these pictures of the fiery judgment from the New Testament. We may forget that it comes from the Old Testament. Song of Solomon 4:6 continues to speak of shadows that flee away. The Midrash says this indicates on the day of judgment, there will be no shadow for the wicked. As it says in Job 24:32, that's not even a verse, is it? That's not even a verse. I don't know let's try to find the actual usually it's like 10 off. It's in Job. Let's cheat. Let's open the one that has the more correct. Let's see. Uh, 34:22. 34:22. Wow. We're both 10 off. 34:22. Job 34:22. There is no darkness and shadow of death where the workers of iniquity may hide themselves. In other words, there's no place for wicked people to hide on the day of judgment. That's what Song of Solomon means when it says the shadows flee away.
Hey, Jacob.
Yeah?
Maybe you're getting there, but is it possible to say that they mentioned the heat of the day to prove the point that those who are righteous before the Lord will come through the fire?
Yeah, I think that's sort of
Or
what's
is-
being alluded to here.
Or is that a stretch? I don't remember any.
The whole thing is a stretch already. So if the heat of the day is a reference to the final judgment, the fact that Abraham has a safe place out of the heat would be important. That would be something the Midrash would expect us to pick up on, even though it doesn't specify that outright.
Yep, good, thanks.
So the Song of Solomon verse continues, I will get me to the mountains of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. The Midrash says mountains of myrrh refers to the temple, and the hill of frankincense alludes to Jerusalem. All right. Next section of the Midrash, same verse. Actually, the next verse, Genesis 18:2. He lifted up his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood over against him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them. Midrash says this reopened his wound from his circumcision. He began to bleed again. So the Midrash is going to go on to sort of pick apart Abraham's response step by step here, and it's going to connect it with blessings that were promised to the Jewish people later on. All these things were given to them in the merit of Abraham, and specifically in the merit of this particular series of actions we see Abraham take to be hospitable to his guests. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, by your life, in reward for your meritorious behavior, I will have compassion upon your descendants in 2 situations involving blood, and I will exact retribution from their enemies through blood. And the verse that it goes to for a proof for this is Ezekiel 16:6. When I passed by you and saw you wallowing in your blood, I said to you, and this Hebrew phrase is difficult to translate. I have 2 translations right in front of me here. One says, live in your blood. One says, live in spite of your blood. It looks to me from the Hebrew that live in your blood is a more literal translation. In context, it may be better to interpret it as live in spite of the fact that you are bleeding. The important thing, though, is it says it twice. Ezekiel has twice, I said to you, live in your blood. I said to you, live in your blood. So the rabbis are saying, well, there's going to be 2 things there. There's going to be 2 different meanings because he says it twice. So the Midrash says 2 different experiences relating to blood are indicated here. The first refers to the Paschal lamb, the original Paschal lamb, the blood of the lamb on the doorposts in Egypt. And the second refers to the blood of the circumcision, right? So the Jewish people lived in Egypt because of the blood of the Paschal lamb on the doorpost. And the Jewish people live somehow from generation to generation through keeping the commandment of circumcision. Because if the Jewish people were to stop circumcising there would be no more Jewish people. When he saw them, he ran to meet them. Another comment on that verse. The Holy One, blessed be he, said to him, in reward for hastening 3 times, I will hasten 3 times to your descendants at the time of the giving of the Torah. What were the 3 times Abraham hastened? Well, he ran to meet them when he saw them. He hastened into the tent to start giving directions. And then he hastened or ran to the herd of animals to get animals to eat. It looks like one animal, but the Midrash is going to say in a second that there may be more than one. Well, where do we find the 3 parallel hastenings that God did later? Midrash says it's in Deuteronomy 33:2. This is in V'zot HaBracha. It's the blessing that Moses gave to the Israelites before he died. And it describes the process of God's appearance at the Sinai event. Moses says, the Lord came from Sinai, shone upon them or rose upon them from Seir, and appeared from Mount Paran. Whereas it goes on, he approached from Ribabot Kodesh, but it seems like 4, but Midrash here only counts 3 of those. It looks like God was hurrying from wherever his presence had been before to get to Sinai to give the Torah to the Jewish people. Midrash continues on Genesis 18:4. Let a little water be fetched and wash your feet and recline yourselves under the tree. Well, because Abraham said that, God says, I will give you the precept of the Paschal lamb. Why does that have to do with fetching water and washing your feet? Well, in Exodus, where they get the Paschal lamb in Exodus 12, they fetch a lamb. So the same Hebrew word there, fetch. And then based on another word in common between the 2 passages, he gives them the ordinance of the Passover, which is more than just the lamb. The ordinance of the Passover has a little bit more to it. Because he said a little, in other words, a little water, this comes back in Exodus 23, by little and little I will drive them out before you. Because he said water, we get spring up a well in Numbers 21. Because he offered to wash their feet, God's going to wash away the filth of his descendants in Isaiah 4:4. Because he offered to help them recline under a tree, he gives them the precept of the sukkah. In Nehemiah 8:15, we have the specific verse about fetching olive branches for the sukkah. For saying, I will fetch a morsel of bread, I will cause bread to rain from heaven. Of course, this is the manna in Exodus 16. And because Abraham offered them curds and milk, we have this promise in Deuteronomy 32 that the Israelites will have those things to eat in the land.
Jacob?
Yes.
Back to the concept of God hurrying to Mount Sinai. Is it possible, I know in one of the portion connections, they talked about Yeshua was lamenting over Jerusalem, and if they had actually repented, that it would have sort of changed history at that point. Is it possible that God didn't really know if Moses was going to go up to Mount Sinai or not until he actually started to? And am I sort of being a heretic in saying that does God honor our total free will, or is there a piece of us that he knows is going to be obedient based on the person? And again, that goes back to this part with Abraham where he's hastening. God is seeing how Abraham really wants to serve.
Yeah, so in Judaism doesn't see any reason not to believe both that God already knows everything, but that we still have the freedom to choose. So this goes all the way back to the days of the Pharisees, and Josephus describes the Pharisees this way. He says, God knows everything, however, all of our choices are in our own hands. And this is still true in Judaism today. Maimonides calls it the pillar of the Torah and all its precepts, that God does not predestine us. Our choices are in our own hands. However, God still knows what we're going to do. The idea that God doesn't know, that God is sort of discovering and experiencing the universe with us, the idea is out there. It's just not Judaism. It is, they would consider it heretical. It's called process theology. It's like, I mean, it's kind of an interesting idea, but it's not kosher. Judaism, it maintains that God knows the end from the beginning and so forth. It's a good question, though. It's one that sort of inevitably pops up as you read the narrative, because God does respond or seems to react to things people do as if he's waiting to see what they're going to do before he decides what he's going to do. But the sages say that when the Torah talks like that, it's just using language, the language of that humans can understand. Because it's hard for us to picture God already knowing everything in advance, and it just sort of blows our minds. So the Torah talks about God like he's finding stuff out along with the reader, but it's not really the case. From this episode, Midrash continues, our sages taught that the righteous say little but do much. So what did Abraham say? He said, I'm going to fetch a morsel of bread. What did he actually do? Well, he prepared a whole bunch of food. So the Midrash says that he, contrary to what you might see there in the text, the Midrash says that Abraham prepared 3 oxen and 9 measures of meal. How does it get to these numbers? Because it looks like 1 ox and 3 measures of meal. Well, in Genesis 18:6, where it says, quick, 3 measures of choice flour, knead and make cakes, or make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes. There's measures is a word, fine is a word, and meal is a word. And each of these words apparently can each indicate a different type of flour. You got measure of flour, fine flour, meal flour. Apparently, the Midrash interprets these as 3 different kinds of flour, and you get 3 of each. So you get 3 measures, 3 fine and 3 meal, and so that makes 9 measures. I don't know enough Hebrew to be able to say whether all 3 of those words are definitely used to describe different kinds of flour, but the Midrash seems to think they are, so we'll go with it. Sim kamasolet, 3 measures of fine meal. How do we know that he took 3 oxen? Same kind of a deal here, where it says, I think, in verse 8, he took an offspring of an ox, tender and good. So, right, the offspring was 1 ox, and then there was another ox that was tender, and there was another ox that was good. So there are 3 oxen. Actually, if you count ox in there too, there could be even 4, the Midrash says, maybe even 4 oxen. 3 oxen, man.
That's a lot of food.
What is it, like 3,000 pounds of beef? So the angels could pretend to chew it, just to be nice, because angels don't eat. It's all about the hospitality. It's it's quite a charcuterie board. That's what my wife says when we're doing the charcuterie board for Thanksgiving. She says it's the illusion of abundance. You just make it look like everything's flowing and falling off the board, and honestly, there's not a whole lot of food there. Although our cutting board is so big that there is a lot of food there, and we always have like 90% left over.
Always good.
Yeah, hopefully Abraham had an industrial refrigerator for all these leftovers. The Holy One, blessed be he, also promised, so here's the parallel. The Holy One, blessed be he, fulfills the same, right? Anything good, God can be seen to do it too. say little and do much. Where did God say little and do much? Well, he promised little to Israel, but did much in her behalf. Where is that? It's in Genesis 15. After, it's in verses 13, 14. So the offspring are going to be enslaved and so forth. For 400 years, going to be oppressed. But Genesis continues in Genesis 15, 14. I will execute judgment. Judgment. And that word judgment in Hebrew is 2 letters. Dan. Dalet and Nun. Just 2 letters. Right? So this is what the Midrash is going to use this to make a point. He says he promised to judge the nations with the letters Dalet and Nun. But ultimately, he exacted retribution from them by means of 72 letters, as implied in Deuteronomy 4:34. Has God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation by trials, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by an outstretched arm, and by great terrors. And there's 72 letters between the words to go until great terrors. This is an interesting verse because it looks really Kabbalistic. God using the letters themselves to execute judgment seems to be what's implied here from a Kabbalistic perspective. And you don't often see that kind of stuff dropped in the middle of a medieval midrash. It's not really too surprising to see it, but it's interesting that it's in there. You expect to see it more in later sources. But so it's fascinating. God is going to use 72 letters to judge the nations. Well, if this is what righteous people do, what do wicked people do? Well, they must say a lot, but not even do a little. Well known that guy. We find this illustrated in Genesis 23, where Ephron says to Abraham, I'm going to give you the field in the cave of Machpelah, remember? I give it to you in the presence of my people and bury your dead there. But then later on, he's like, well, it is worth 400 shekels. So he did not, and the Midrash says it wasn't worth 400 shekels. So Rabbi Hanina stated, whenever a shekel is mentioned in the Pentateuch, its value is a selah. When it's mentioned in the prophets, its value is a litra. When it's mentioned in the writings, its value is a centenaria. I don't know what any of that is worth. The shekel mentioned by Ephron had the value of a centenarian. It looks like a selah is a standard sacred shekel. A litra is a quarter of a shekel. And a centenaria is 100,000 sesterces. I don't know what that means. It looks like the shekel devalues over time, which you would expect. That's sort of what happens. The currency, the Romans would continually debase their currency so that the denarius eventually ended up being essentially useless. All right, so we're through that bit. We're now on to this part where God has some plans for Sodom and Gomorrah, and he's trying to figure out what he's going to do as far as telling Abraham what's about to happen, because Abraham's nephew Lot is there. So God sort of, oddly enough, he sort of internally decides that he needs to tell Abraham first before he goes on with this judgment. This is Genesis 18:17. Shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing? It's a rhetorical question. May it please our master to teach us, and this is going to sound like it's something about something completely different, but this is what the Midrash does for us. May it please our master to teach us whether one may recite the Targum while looking into the Torah scroll. The Targum is the Aramaic translation of the Torah. In Yeshua's time, for example, this is what you would hear read in the synagogue, because you didn't speak Hebrew fluently, probably you spoke Aramaic. So they needed to translate it for everyone to understand. The question is, can you look into the Torah scroll and off the top of your head translate it into Aramaic so it looks like you're reading Aramaic out of the Torah scroll? And the masters taught, no, actually it's forbidden to look into the Torah scroll while translating it, because otherwise someone might contend that the translation is in there in the Torah scroll. Conversely, one who reads the Torah is forbidden to turn away from the scroll as he reads. Right? You can't be reading and then look up and start saying it from memory or whatever. You need to be watching the letters the whole time, because the Torah was only given in writing. As it says in Exodus 34, I will inscribe upon the tablets the words that were on the first tablets. That is why anyone who is translating the Torah in public is forbidden to look into the Torah scroll while doing so. Rabbi Yehuda, the son of Pazi, declared, there is an entire verse in Scripture that deals with this subject. Apparently, Exodus 34:27. It says, write down these commandments. For after the tenor of these words, or in accordance with these words, I have made a covenant with you and with Israel. Write these words is a reference to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, which were given in writing. The other phrase, this phrase, the tenor of these words, or accordance of these words, is an oblique reference to the Targum, the translation of the Torah, that was given orally. We find here the common view in Judaism that Targum Onkelos was not written by Onkelos, but was in fact rediscovered or redelivered through Onkelos. And hence the high value placed on the Targum by many later commentators. So I remember when we went through Ramban, very often he would say, this is how Onkelos renders this verse into Aramaic. He would bring that as a proof for his viewpoint. And Maimonides, who would often believe the opposite, would still go to Onkelos for a proof for his viewpoint. Why are they treating this Onkelos translation of the Torah as something worth quoting, as some authoritative source? Well, this is why. There's a viewpoint that Onkelos was merely writing down what had been transmitted orally since the time of Moses in Aramaic, an authoritative, inspired Aramaic translation of the Torah. Keep that in mind when you hear about Onkelos in a Jewish context. It's not just some convert's attempt to translate the Torah into Aramaic. It's considered to have a degree of authoritativeness. It's an important piece of Jewish literature. And the more you know about how the Targum phrases things, the more you see its choices and its theology reflected in the New Testament as well. So it's worth getting into a little bit of that. There's one really good book I've read about this. I think it's by John Rollins or something. It's called The Targums and John's Logos Theology. I've got it if anyone wants to borrow it. It's really good. This really confusing passage in the first chapter of the Gospel of John, where it talks about the word. It looks like John is drawing this word, this concept of word from the Targum, from the Aramaic translation of the Torah. And once you realize that that's the idea he's drawing on, it starts to make more sense. So this is what the Midrash means when it says the translation of the Torah that was given orally. It's talking about the Aramaic Targum. And it reflects the belief that it is inspired, an authoritative Aramaic translation of the Torah. The Midrash continues, Rabbi Yehuda the son of Shimon, is it Shimon or Simon? It's Simon. Rabbi Yehuda the son of Simon contended that the verse after the tenor of these words, I've made a covenant with you and with Israel, refers to both the written and the oral law. Right, so he's saying, no, it's not about the Targum, it's about the other thing that was given orally, the oral law, which is, of course, the Mishnah, or if you prefer, maybe even more than the Mishnah, but the body of Jewish oral tradition. If you should perpetuate the written law in written form, and that which was given orally by word of mouth, then I will have made a covenant with you and with Israel. But if you convert the written law into oral transmission, in other words, you stop writing Torah scrolls and you just try to memorize it and pass it down orally, if you set the oral law down in writing, which appears to be what happened with the Mishnah, I will not have made an everlasting covenant with you. So either this is wrong, or they didn't put the whole oral law in writing. Maybe the Mishnah is only part of it, or maybe you have to do both. Maybe you have to convert the written law to oral and the oral law to writing. Or maybe this is just a homiletic injunction to try to keep everything straight. Don't get the written law mixed up with the oral law. Rabbi Yehuda the son of Shalom maintained Moses wanted to write down the Mishnah, the oral law, but the Holy One, blessed be He, foresaw that in the course of time, nations would translate the Torah into Greek, and they would all read it in Greek, and then they would say, hey, look, we're Israelites too. There's people who do that today. See, we're actually just as much Jewish as the Jews. However, this is probably a reference to the Christian theology, which says that the church comes to override or replace the Jewish people as Israel. And that's only possible because they only had the vocabulary to do that, because the Old Testament had been translated into Greek. It's called the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So I think this is a dig against the Christians. Hence, the Holy One, blessed be He, told Moses, should I write for him never so many things of my law? I don't know if that's weird translation or wrong reference. Let's see if I can find a reference. Hosea 5:12. Hosea 5:12. Hosea 5:12 says in this translation, I wrote for them the great principles of my Torah, and they regarded them as something alien. All right. I think the point it's trying to make there is that if all of the oral law had been written down, it would be regarded as something alien, or Israel would be regarded as strangers, which would be another way to translate the very terse Hebrew poetry there. But that's not the point. The point is why. Why is it a problem to write down the oral law? The Midrash answers, because the oral law contains the mysteries of the Holy One, blessed be He, and He reveals His mysteries only to the righteous. Right? So by keeping the oral law oral, the leaders of the Jewish community can sort of gatekeep who gets to hear about it, who gets to study it, who gets to read the whole thing, not read, but hear the whole thing. As it is said, Psalm 25:14, the counsel of the Lord is with them that fear him, not with everybody, just with them that fear him. Similarly, you find that after the Sodomites angered the Holy One, blessed be he, and he was moved to destroy them, he consulted only Abraham. Now we come to our verse, shall I hide from Abraham that which I am doing? Well, the next section is too long to finish in 2 minutes, so we'll stop here. In the middle of Vayera Siman 5. If I say that out loud, I'll remember where it is next week. But we're going to continue in the same idea of God's favoring Abraham, Abraham being beloved, and God revealing himself only to certain people.